So, in general, crises of various types are often a threat to democracy. Autocratic minded leaders throughout history have taken advantage of crises, taken advantage of situations where citizens are fearful and look to the state for protection. They take advantage of that to concentrate power, to declare a state of emergency, maybe to suspend the Constitution, maybe to oppress opponents. And I think that was a widespread expectation when this pandemic began. It was widely expected that we would see want to be autocrats seizing power, concentrating power. And that's happened in a few places. It's happened in Hungary. I think it's happening in El Salvador. To some extent, it's happening in India and Philippines. But it hasn't happened that much. I think many leaders, particularly more populist-minded leaders, including the presidents of the United States and Brazil, responded very, very badly to the crisis. We're sort of living in a fantasy world, and that very quickly undermined their performance. And that undermining of their performance weakened them. So we see some governments concentrating power in response to the crisis. We see other governments that have been weakened by the crisis. So there's not a clear generalized effect across the globe. I think now that's the short term. One other thing is my greatest concern, my biggest worry in terms of democracy amid this pandemic is that this is going to bring a serious social and economic crisis across the globe, and it's going to hit Latin America especially hard. It's an economic crisis that could endure, a social and economic crisis that could endure for a long time, could endure for years, and will hit the poor the hardest. And that's going to generate a lot of discontent. One thing we know about prolonged economic crises is that they undermine new and weak democracies. And my fear is that this economic crisis could end up being something like Europe in the 1930s, which undermined a large number of new and weak democracies. So maybe not all of Latin America, but the weaker democracies in the region, Ecuador, Peru, Panama, Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and perhaps elsewhere, I think those democracies could be really vulnerable. Not necessarily today or tomorrow, but in the years to come.
I agree completely. I think that a pandemic can work in two different sides. One side, it would be, okay, let's think that with a pandemic, science will be stronger, journalism will be stronger, but that's not what's happening now. What we can see, and I agree completely again, it's some authoritarian, autocratic, or even populist governments trying to use democracy, kidnapping the meaning of democracy, and trying to show that they are really, because they think I was elected, so I am a democratic person, but they are not. What we are seeing, and I want to ask you if you agree with me, that we have I am a woman, so we can see that some women that are leaders like in Singapore, Iceland, Finland, Taiwan, they are trying to show other forms of using power. Now, I would like to ask you if you see some difference in this sense, because I think that you have some leaders that are using pandemic, as you said as a kind of window of opportunity to become more and more authoritarian, more and more populist. I agree completely with you about Latin America. I live in Brazil. Brazil, it's a very unequal country. And in this moment, we are facing a crisis that I think is the first time in our history. An economic crisis, a social crisis, a health crisis, but also a moral crisis, because we have a president that has, Bolsonaro has Donald Trump as an idol, as a symbol, and he's using pandemic to deny data about COVID in Brazil. to deny the science, to deny the work of journalists, and to think he can talk using people and saying, I'm your voice. I can talk for the people. This is very much what's happening in Latin America. We call here democradura. That's a mix of democracy and dictatorship. But what do you think? Do you think that democracy that pandemic can also create new forms of power of, in the world, or just you are just negative about this?
Um, it's hard. It's hard to tell. I mean, I want to get back to the point about women in power because I think that's really interesting. But to answer the last bit of the question, we're at the beginning of this crisis. This is a crisis that is going to endure for a while, at the very least until we have a vaccine that's distributed across the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And the social and economic consequences will be severe. So what is happening today doesn't necessarily tell us much about what will eventually emerge. And a week ago, I was entirely pessimistic about what was happening in the United States and our society, the dysfunctionality of our political system, which has a lot of parallels to Brazil, the inability as a society to respond to this crisis. And I was deeply depressed about the state of things in the United States. This week, over the course of 1 week, some things have changed a lot. We have the most significant wave of social protests in the history of the United States that is quite likely going to bring some very positive progressive change. I would not be surprised to see you can never predict large-scale social protest, but I wouldn't be shocked to see something similar eventually emerge in Brazil. So
it's already emerged.
There you go. So it's hard. It's very hard to speculate about the future. I think we would be wrong. I think, or it'd be very limited to say all is inevitably negative. But I worry a lot because Latin America was the last quarter century of Latin America's history has, despite all of the terrible limitations, been among the brightest in Latin American history. We've seen a level of democratic inclusion that has never before been seen in Latin America, at least not without a significant right-wing reaction. And I fear that given the beating that the popular sectors are taking and will take as a result of this crisis, and the fiscal crisis that inevitably is going to hit every Latin American government, no matter how they respond, that this process of increasing inclusion that we've seen across Latin America, including Brazil, since the 1980s, that it's going to be stopped.
Yeah.
Returning to this question of women, I think you're right. I think we've seen enough, and you even see this among governors in the United States. We've seen enough cases to be able to generalize and say that women are very rarely at the helm of disastrous, irresponsible, reckless, catastrophic responses of the kind that we've seen in Belarus, in Brazil, in the United States, to some extent in Mexico. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's so much harder for women to ascend to power that you've got to be really good. You've got to have, I don't know how much more competence to rise to the top, whether it's in Norway or Iceland or Taiwan or New Zealand or various states in the United States. You've got to be a highly competent leader, or Germany, in order to rise to the top. The other thing is women are rarely populists. It's possible. I mean, there are some female populists, Indira Gandhi in India in the 1970s, but most of the time, populist figures are male. And it's populists who are most likely to respond in a catastrophic way to this pandemic because they are anti-elite, they are anti-intellectual, they are
science.
They're anti-science, and they're anti-expert. And they basically, in various ways, claim to kind of have first of all, to be able to resolve problems personally. And so they don't like to defer to experts. And second of all, they often claim that they have a certain common wisdom that the experts lack. And so both Trump and Bolsonaro repeatedly say that they know what the epidemiologists do not know.
Yeah.
And is not and so you can survive that in normal times, maybe. You can muddle through as a society. But in an epidemic, it's suicide. And it's more likely that those figures are going to be men.
I don't want to win this battle, but I think Bolsonaro is worse, because now, after two health ministers that were specialists, now we have a general that has no idea and is a kind of puppet, Bolsonaro's puppet. So I don't want to enter in this kind of competition, but Bolsonaro is taking part of public manifestations, encouraging violence, evading numbers. So it's really difficult. And then, just to say that you were completely correct again, last week, we had the first manifestations in Brazil, public manifestations, and also the creation of various manifestos, all of them asking for the politicians to be together, to don't think about differences, let us be together against this populist and authoritarian government. This is brand new and very interesting, because I think another thing that we can compare, and it would be interesting, that and I know that this kind of public manifestation is very difficult in the pandemic moment, as we are experiencing now. It's very paradoxical, lots of contradictions. But at the same time, the race question, the race issue was very important to ask people to be together against the worst. We live in countries that race matters a lot. I think we have some differences among us. I would guess and say that the civil rights language started very late in Brazil, just at the end of the 70s. And that was really a problem, because in Brazil, we had that very strong myth of racial democracy. Also, Brazilians they are very used to say, I'm not a racist, probably you are, but I'm not. No? And also, we do not have this language of official or legal apartheid. But even so, racism, it's terrible in the United States, and it's really terrible in Brazil. In Brazil, we call structural racism and institutional racism. And the one thing in Brazil, and I want to ask you about it, is that in Brazil, because of this long term of the slave system, but in the whole country, not just in the parts of the country, also after our golden law, that it was a very short law and a very conservative law, after Republic that promised inclusion but delivered exclusion, what we have in Brazil, race created a kind of invisibility, a kind of silence, and Brazilians naturalize race. So for us, it's brand new. So you have people in the streets, you have manifestos, and all of them trying to show that race is not invisible. So race is really visible in Brazil. But I would like to ask you about your opinion in this area.
Well, I know a lot less about race in Brazil. I think there are really important parallels there, and much of the democratic crisis in the United States today, the extreme polarization that is ripping apart United States democracy, it's about race. It is a reaction, a long-term reaction to democratization. Americans like to think that that U.S. democracy was born in the 18th century. The U.S. democracy was born, or U.S. finally achieved democracy in 1965 when we extended citizenship to everybody in the United States, to African Americans, and voting rights to all people. And it was only with the achievement of at least legal equality and some level of minimal integration. That is what began the process of polarization. And what we see now in Trumpism is a reaction of the white Christian majority that is losing its numerical majority because we're becoming a more diverse society. And most importantly of all, it's losing its dominant social status. If you go back 50 years, if you go back to my childhood, you would find at the top of every hierarchy, political hierarchy, economic hierarchy, social hierarchy, cultural hierarchy, at the top was a white Christian male. All of the top business leaders, all of the governors, the presidents, the cabinet members, the senators, the community leaders, the television newscasters, the celebrities, the scientific experts, all of them were white Christian men. Those days are over. We have achieved much in the last 50 years. But what the extreme radicalized right-wing reaction we're seeing in the United States is driven by the anger of white Christians who are losing that dominant status. That is fundamentally what the fight in the United States is about. It's what is ripping apart the fabric of our democracy. And but there are important changes. And the most important one, the one that gives me some hope, and then I want to ask about the parallels to Brazil, is over the last few decades, but certainly and accelerating since the rise of Trump, is we are seeing, African Americans are 11% of the population, and they lack economic power. For the most part, they're not as well armed as white people. So politically, by themselves, they're limited in their political power. What we're seeing now, much more than the 1950s and 60s, much more than the civil rights movement, is a truly multiracial coalition behind democratic reform. We're seeing a very, very large number of mostly urban, well-educated, mostly upper middle class, mostly younger whites aligning with and supporting the cause of racial justice. And it's really, for the first time, a true majority in the country that is lining up behind racial justice. That's something that's new, and I think it's cause for optimism. So I guess my question to you, first of all, is to what extent do you see the rise of Bolsonarismo as a reaction to the advances on the racial justice front that occurred under Cardoso and especially Lula, and I guess Dilma?
Yes, I do. I think that in 1988, when Brazil had its last constitution, the citizenship constitution, during 30 years, we have a kind of democracy in Brazil. This kind of democracy, I don't think, as you mentioned, those days are over. In Brazil, those days are not over. But what happened? We have new faces in politics, in the university, in the cultural levels, in religion. But I agree with you, Bolsonarism, the followers of Bolsonaro are all white, middle class, and they are all very angry against, not just against Black people, but against LGBTQ people, against all kinds of advance in our civil agenda. Brazil has a difference with the United States. You mentioned that in the United States, Blacks are 11%, no? It's 11 or 13%. In Brazil, yes, Brazil is 50. If we put together Black people and pardos, it's very difficult to define. I think I know you know about it, but it's very difficult. But even so, putting together Black people and pardos, they are 56% of our society.
Big difference.
Big difference. And even so, Steve, if you think about our history, I mean, the official history, it's an European history. I'm not saying we don't have to teach our students about Portugal. Of course we have. But why do we do not speak about Africa? Why we do not speak about native people? And that's unbelievable in Brazil. If you think about imagination, our Brazilian imagination is all white. It's very interesting because we have a lot of heroes like Tiradentes, for example, that it was a leader of a kind of rebellion in Minas Gerais. Tiradentes had no face. The documents didn't show his face. But even so, Brazilian elite created this hero at the end of the monarchy and beginning of republic like a white hero. Eventually, he looks like Jesus Christ. Hair is here, white clothes. So it's very funny. And then, but we do not have black leaders. We do not have women in our official history. So Brazil is a very, in this sense, I think that we are. It's not true that we do not have a black movement. No, since the end of monarchy, it was a black movement that helped to put an end to the slave system. We had a lot of newspapers, associations, but I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about this naturalization that society can create, how people cannot see. I think we have an elite that it's completely blind. And also we have this white middle class that it's furious against these new agendas. And they want to put time, that they want to stop it. And they say Brazil is passing through economic crisis since 2013, 2014, and now they are blaming these people and say it's your fault. You are not in the correct place. So for the first time, and I think that there is a sign that one thing is positive, it's the first time that people cannot say we do not have this problem. We are forced to say we have this problem. And they are, and black and Pardo people, they are 56% of our population. So let's talk about the Africans that enter in Brazil. No? Do you think that we can have a democracy with racism, or is that possible or impossible in your opinion?
Yes, I mean but it's only possible if we safeguard the state. So racism can be in society. It's always going to be to some extent in society. We would love to eliminate entirely, but we imagine there'll be some racism in society. A political system, I think, can be democratic to the extent that we shield the state from societal racism. Now, that's not entirely possible, but the critical thing is we need to make sure that the racism in society does not pervade the state, because once it does, then you're inevitably going to get differential treatment, differential state treatment of citizens. You get the police treating black people one way and white people another way. That's not a democracy. Yeah. That's not equal citizenship. So as soon as the cancer of racism pervades the state, democracy begins to be diminished.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the problem in Brazil, because we are killing a whole generation of black people that live in the suburbs of the big towns in Brazil. And we know that we have a police that it's really, really violent, and police has a target. So that's why I would say that at least in Brazil, we cannot have democracy with racism at the same time. But maybe you could start talking about the riots in.
Well, look, I mean, this is exactly what's happening in the United States. The United States has achieved quite a bit in combating institutionalized racism over the last 50 years. But one area where we've achieved very little, or certainly not remotely enough, is in law enforcement. and the police force. The police force is localized, so it varies by municipality. But many of our country's police forces are heavily racist.
Yep.
They are whites are overrepresented, white men are overrepresented, and white men with authoritarian attitudes and racist attitudes are overrepresented. And both norms, informal rules, and formal rules permit them to, without much accountability, to engage in large-scale violence against blacks. Now, it's not just the police. The criminal justice system has been incarcerating African Americans at a much higher rate for decades as well. So
Yes.
this very important part of the state, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, is continues to this day to be heavily permeated by racism. And that's what these protests are about. They are about combating this really powerful bastion of racism in the 21st century U.S. state. I think it was, it's never possible to predict when a wave of protest will emerge, but we happen to have, technology played a big role. The fact that now in the 21st century, acts of horrendous racial violence committed by the state, which have occurred since the founding of the Republic, they've occurred since the 18th century without stop. But now they're captured on cell phones and diffused to the entire country. You can't hide it. You can't deny it. You can't explain it. It's there. So that's one factor. We had 3 or 4 of these cases in a row, all within 1 month. And I think another factor, kind of paradoxically, and this may happen in Brazil too, is the coronavirus crisis, I think, contributed to the protests as well. Because first of all, because of people are sick and tired and frustrated of being at home, many people have lost their jobs and are very, very discontented because of the economic situation. Plus, everybody is home. So rather than people being busy doing all sorts of things, everybody was home to watch that killing on videotape. And so the combination of this horrendous act of violence that's videotaped at a time of mass discontent, and nobody has anything else to do but watch it, was sort of the recipe that lit this fire. It's also, and this may happen in Brazil, it is a massive protest. It includes people from all walks of life. It extends way beyond the African American community. It includes all different races. It is both urban and rural, and to a large extent, it is a mobilization against Trump. There have been some protests against Trump, particularly the Women's March of a few years ago, but it's really the first time that people have been able to engage in collective mobilization against a government that 50-something% of the population really despises. And so it is definitely a social movement of mobilization against this last bastion of racism in the state, but it's also a generalized rebellion against Trump.
Yeah, I think it's the same in Brazil. And there is another thing that it's becoming to be very clear in Brazil that wasn't clear, is that the idea that the race system was created by whites. So if you want to be an anti-racist, you have to start acting. You have to start doing things. So this is one thing that it was very important in Brazil. So you have to start looking around, have a look in your work, in your office, if you have Black people, have a look in your program in the university, if you have Black authors, have a look in your, I don't know, in the theaters, if you have Black people. So I think that we are starting a moment in Brazil, finally, that the white elite it's obliged to see it. That's one thing. The other thing is, as you said, that Bolsonaro was, it was very funny. I live in São Paulo. So we had, last Sunday, we had a Bolsonaro manifestation against the democratic institutions. And in another place, we had a bigger manifestation against Bolsonaro, against authoritarianism, against the genocide for Black people, against the genocide for all of us, because if we do not have data, how can we predict the crisis? How can we work with the crisis? But talking about this, I want to ask you about another topic, impeachment. You had in the United States a process of impeachment, and at the moment in Brazil, in the Congress, the president of the Congress has in his hands 30 different processes asking for impeachment. What's your opinion about impeachment? Maybe you can talk about Trump's impeachment and then later on talk about impeachment and pandemia, if it's a good combination or it's a terrible combination.
Okay, my view on impeachment in both countries is it's kind of similar, but it's complicated. Impeachment is a very powerful tool. It's a tool that must be used with great restraint. In the book How Democracies Die, we spend a lot of time talking about the norm of forbearance, how politicians must use institutions with restraint, and oftentimes if you fail to do that, if you engage in what we call constitutional hardball, you can be entirely legal and yet still you can act in ways that are entirely legal and yet still undermine democracy. And so I am very I think impeachment ought to be used rarely and only in extreme circumstances. For that reason, I am very critical of the impeachment against Bill Clinton in the year 1998. I think it was a case of constitutional hardball, an early norm violation by the Republicans. I was also very critical of the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, because again, I think it was basically an excuse. It was done for political reasons, not because she had committed a crime. So I think in both the United States in the late 1990s and in Brazil in 2016, impeachment was overused. Now that said, impeachment should be used rarely. It should be used in extreme circumstances, but it was designed to remove from power leaders who abuse power and who threaten their societies. I think Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro have both shown themselves to be really serious threats to the health of their societies. They have both abused power. They both apparently, or at least reportedly, behaved in criminal ways, and both of them, even if we define impeachment as something that should only be used in the last instance, under rare circumstances, we are in those circumstances in both Brazil and the United States. And there's this additional thing, in addition to even before the pandemic, I think both Bolsonaro and Brazil and Trump had abused power to a degree that merited it. But now we've reached a point where their responses to the pandemic are threatening the health of literally millions of their citizens. So it becomes really quite urgent, in my view. And I was going to ask you, given that Bolsonaro has, in recent months, isolated himself and lost at least part of the center-right establishment that had backed him, that allowed him to come to power initially. The defection of Moro is obviously an important step in that direction. Given that, what are the prospects for impeachment in Brazil?
Okay, I think it can be very difficult. First of all, Brazil, if you talk about the new republic that started after 88, this would be the third process of impeachment. That's too much. So we had Fernando Collor. That was a very legal and popular process of impeachment. But then we had I agree completely with you, Dilma Rousseff impeachment, that it was not good for our democracy, not good at all. So, because after the impeachment, all these people that was like, I don't know where they were hiding. I don't know where we couldn't see them. Then they, like mushrooms, they showed up, showing that they wanted a new Brazil, a very angry Brazil, a very polarized Brazil. Bolsonaro won election with a very strong anti-PT feeling and sentiment. We know that the financial area preferred Bolsonaro compared to PT, even if it was Fernando Haddad. And we know that now the situation after Moro, when Moro, as Moro is not in the government, the situation is different. But even so, Bolsonaro has 30% of loyal, very loyal followers. This kind of people call him myth. So a president is not a myth, no? And his son, they call little myth, Eduardo Bolsonaro. So that's a problem, because this is a kind of people that you cannot talk with them. They don't wanna start a dialogue with all the people. They treat opponents like enemies, as you mentioned in your book. No, this is it's a kind of genre, no, of the populist governments. So if you think about the traditional conditions for an impeachment, one can say that first you have to be in a financial crisis helps an impeachment. We are. Second, we have the leader has to have a very low popularity, like 10%. That's not true for Bolsonaro. And third, pandemic. It's very difficult to deal with this kind of very complex process in a situation like this, that you cannot see people. Now they are going to vote in their homes. So that's, in my opinion, that's very difficult. But we have other scenarios. First, Bolsonaro's behavior, if he continues like this, because he's more and more radical now. Week after week, he's becoming more and more radical. Second, if we have a kind of collapse in the social structure. Third, if the fake news process will develop against Bolsonaro. And fourth, if the political problems that are surrounding Bolsonaro family will show up, like connections with militia, corruption, as Flávio Bolsonaro is facing a process. So maybe we could start an impeachment process. But there is a research that was organized by Eurasia group, and they say that even so, and even having all these elements, that we have 25% of chances to be successful in this process of impeachment. So it's very difficult to say what's going to happen. No? I always say that historians, you are better in this sense, but historians are very, we are terrible at predicting the future. But I think it's, at the moment, it might be difficult. But situation is changing very, very quickly in Brazil. So maybe if you are going to talk in 2 weeks, it's going to be different. But as I think that we have to finish now, what do you think about future?
So ordinarily, you would look at how disastrously the United States is being governed. We're had among the world's worst responses to the pandemic. We're have had more deaths, more cases of COVID than any country on earth, and the situation is really not improving much. The economy has collapsed. Unemployment is now in double digits. The whole country is on fire. You would think that Donald Trump would lose very badly in the election. That this is a terrible, terrible performance. In addition to that, the United States' profile in the world, its stature in the world has shrunk dramatically. So this has been a disastrous government. You would think that Trump would lose a massive defeat. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen for reasons that are kind of similar to Brazil. U.S. society is very, very deeply polarized. And Trump supporters, which are a little more than 30%, it's closer to 40%, 38, 40%, who will support Trump no matter what. Yeah. They are voting not because they necessarily agree with his policies or they think he's performing well, but because he represents the defense of their white Christian identity. And they will support him no matter what happens. And so there will not be a landslide election. It will be a very close election, much like the last election, almost no matter what. The only thing that's really up in the air available is about 10% of the electorate, which is more independent and could go either way. Now, before the pandemic, in early 2020, I think Donald Trump had a light advantage. It was about 50-50, but he had a very good chance at re-election. His standing in the polls has slipped since then. And now I think that he stands a pretty good chance to lose. Again, he won't lose by a lot, but the polls today suggest that Biden will win. That 10% of independent voters is now shifting heavily towards the opposition. So if the election were today, Donald Trump would certainly lose. I do think, however, there is a possibility of an institutional crisis on election day in a couple of different ways. One is the pandemic. Unlike other Western democracies, the United States has not gotten the pandemic under control. There are well over 1 million infected Americans out there that are known. The number of cases is not going down, and there is some reason to think it may get worse as the weather cools in the fall. So we could have an out of control health situation when we're supposed to vote. The solution to that is and we have the technical capacity, the resources to do it. The solution is to give every American the possibility to vote by mail. But the Trump administration and the Republican Party is actively working to prevent. Some states will allow it. Some states will facilitate it. Other states will not. And so we may have a situation in some critical states where people are afraid to go out and vote. They can't vote by mail. They must vote in person. We rely in our elections on volunteer poll workers, the people who actually work at the tables collecting the votes are volunteers. They're usually retired people 75 years old who will volunteer. Yeah. So there will be a lack of election workers, which means that they will reduce the number of polling places, which means that there will be long lines to vote in the cities, and people will either not have time because of work, or they won't have the patience to wait in line, or simply they'll be afraid of infection if they stand in line. So there's a worst case scenario in which the turnout in the election is heavily affected by the chaos of the coronavirus. It could be that the turnout is most heavily affected in the cities, where it's likely to be worse. And those are areas of support for the opposition. So it could be a situation in which Trump is losing in the polls, but there's a chaotic election in which turnout goes way down in the cities and Trump wins anyway. That could. The other thing that could happen is many of the state elections, the elections, the electoral college works at the state level, and there are many states that are going to have very close elections. That will be ties, so close that there will probably be a recount, and there may be differences between the two parties and how to follow which procedures for the recount. And so there is a very good chance that in this polarized situation, that the two parties will not agree on the procedures of what's happening. That some people will worry about fraud. And Donald Trump, over and over and over again since 2016, every time he thinks he's going to lose an election or sees his party losing election, just tweets out that this is fraud. And if he does that, half the country is going to believe that the election is being stolen from Donald Trump. And that could create a major crisis. If he loses by a lot, nobody will believe it. No one will take it seriously. Trump, if he loses, will say there's fraud. If he loses by a lot, it won't be credible. But it's a very close election, and Trump says there's fraud, we could be in trouble.
Yeah. And what's the consequence for the rest of the world? Because I'm not talking just about Bolsonaro, that he dreams about Trump every day, but I'm talking about the rest of the world that is facing this very authoritarian wave, very populistic wave, that Trump is a kind of symbol of this new face of anti-democracy or new democracy, as you explain in your book.
I mean, for better and worse, I think in many cases for worse, but like it or not, the United States is a model and a referent for much of the rest of the world. And when Obama is president and we're taking steps toward democracy, that may be okay. But when we have an authoritarian populist racist in power who routinely calls the media the enemy of the people, this is legitimizing authoritarian behavior across the world. Presidents across the world are assaulting journalists and saying, hey, the president of the United States does it. So this very negative consequences. It works both ways. I mean, I think the protests that are occurring this week are a very positive model. And if we manage as a society to get together and defeat Trump, that will be a very positive statement. So, I mean, I don't want to overstate, but I think if Trump is reelected, it's going to make American democracy, U.S. democracy, unrecognizable. I think it will, potentially kill American democracy, or at least seriously damage our institutions. And it will probably destroy whatever positive impact the United States can have on liberalism and liberal democracy globally. I think even if Trump is defeated, the United States' stature in the world is irrevocable. It was already declining. That decline was accelerated under Trump. I don't think we'll go back to being the sort of, for better or worse, I don't think we'll go back to being a model for the world the way we were at some periods of the 20th century. But at least we can arrest the decline. At least we can be a smaller force for good rather than a model essentially of pseudo-fascism.
Yeah. Let's hope that democracy will continue to be the democracy that we studied, no? And it's not going to be this weak democracy, as you mentioned. And in Brazil, we are going to cross our fingers because Bolsonaro is saying that he's going to be our president until 28. So, and that will destroy Brazil and will destroy, because I think the institutions are working, democratical institutions are still working in Brazil. But Bolsonaro I know that Trump now starting talking about the army or using but Bolsonaro, he talks about dictatorship and about all kinds of, he's kidnapping our democracy. So let's hope that civil society will be, I don't know if civil society is going to be in the streets, but maybe civil society is going to show up and avoid this kidnap of democracy, no?
And this has implications. This has implications for all of Latin America. I mean, I agree with you. Bolsonaro is more openly authoritarian than Trump. Trump is basically a clown with authoritarian instincts.
Bolsonaro is also a clown.
He's also a clown, but he has much more developed authoritarian ideas than Trump.
And he is connected with the army. So it's
just as what happens in the United States has an impact elsewhere. It's same thing with Brazil. Bolsonaro is also a model for a new type of illiberal right-wing figure in Latin America.
Yes.
And it's terrifying. His election and his being in power in Brazil is terrifying enough for Brazilians. But if he were to succeed politically, if he were to able to subvert democracy and get away with it, if you were able to be popular and be politically successful and get reelected and consolidate power, that would, I think, almost inevitably lead to more Bolsonaros elsewhere in Latin America. He will become a model the way that Hugo Chavez did on the left.
Yep.
So far, Bolsonaro, because he's not been terribly successful, that hasn't happened much. But it worries me a lot.
Yeah. I think that the health situation in Brazil, it's not going to be good for Bolsonaro. And all our neighbors are closing frontiers because all of them, they consider that Brazil failed and the way Brazil tried to avoid the growing of pandemic, and the numbers that we are seeing or not seeing in Brazil because Bolsonaro is trying to deny. But even so, I think let's hope for the best. No, and I want to thank you very much for this lecture. That was really a lecture for us, and so good to have. You are a very popular author in Brazil, and we don't want to see how democracies die. I want to see how democracies survive.
Yeah, it's very depressing. Unfortunately, the book that book sells well in places where democracy is most in crisis.
Yeah.
And it's very it's always, it's good news for book sales, but it always means it's bad news for the country. So I hope that Brazilian democracy recovers and people lose interest in my book as a result.
No, they will not. But I hope Brazilian democracy will survive the United States also. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.